I'm Scott Sanders, and this is the Reach Australia podcast, a podcast all about seeing healthy, evangelistic, multiplying churches across Australia. Now, we're continuing our series in Pastoring with Purpose, and today's episode, we're going to be pushing into some of the objections to pastoring with purpose. So I'm going to ask Greg Lee, the lead pastor from Hunter Bible Church, to sort of answer some of these objections. So is team pastoring just for big churches? Isn't this just too corporate? Where is the love? Who does the pastoring? Hang on, I thought pastoring was all about teaching the Bible. So we're going to answer some of those objections, and it's really helpful to have you, Greg, push into some of those things. So if you've got some objections to the ecosystem which don't get covered here, or just some points that you like cleared up, feel free to reach out to me. Jump on the website, reachaustralia.com.au, and very happy to clarify those. You've pressed play on objections to pastoring with purpose. Okay, now, Greg, the average church in Australia has less than 100 adults on a Sunday. And so this first objection is really important. Isn't pastoring with purpose just big church thinking?
No. Everything we've been talking about in terms of ecosystems and pathways, they're not size dependent. They're in every single church. So there is a pathway, a discipleship pathway in every church, and there is an ecosystem in every church. The difference between small church and large church will be a difference in complexity and maybe the ability to staff it. But you've got an ecosystem when you've got 6 people, when you've got 3 people. And so you need to be thinking about this regardless of size. But here's the thing, the earlier you start thinking about it, the easier it is to overcome those growth barriers. And so I think this is a bit of a cart before the horse thing. Often people look at it and look at big churches and see this ecosystem thinking and think, they're doing the ecosystem thinking because they're big. It's actually the other way around. Part of the way they manage to grow is by attending to the ecosystem thinking early. And
I think part of the issue is that it's been big churches that have been communicating this and illustrating this. I think part of the other problem is we're all concrete thinkers and we want to see it concretely. And the examples have been big church where it's been staffed with a pastor and staffed with a specialist structure. And a key part of understanding that is that you need to move towards a specialist staff team, as a sort of a breaking through a size barrier, and that is often happening at sort of the 350, 400 mark. But prior to that, actually, if you're getting ecosystem rightly thought out, it's actually having volunteer leaders, team leaders, who are actually pushing into those key purpose areas.
Yeah, especially because you then reach a size where in order to, even in a big church, make it work, you've got to have volunteers doing almost everything anyway. We can't afford to have staff running all of the different parts of the ecosystem and the pathway. Most of it is run by volunteers. And so you start off with volunteers, you do move into a bit where it's a lot of paid people, but you still end up with volunteers. Yeah.
And so I think it's really important as well. We've tried to, just in this podcast series, think about the principles. Then you've got to ask the question, well, how do we actually get this done? Well, you are going to need to manage and build structures for a Sunday for gatherings. You are going to need to think about a small group structure. And that could be 1-to-1. It could be in, 3s. It could be in 12s. It could be in 20s. It could be in 40s. You're going to need to think of some sort of smaller structure. You are going to need to think about ministry teams. And over all this, you are going to need to have an organisational structure. Now, what it looks like in Hunter's context and for where they're at in their church life cycle is going to be very different from a church plant and where it's at in its life cycle and its context, and a church that's been established for a number of years and is trying to transition to this purpose pastoring model as well.
Yeah, so you'd say different sizes will end up with different programs and different levels of payment, but there is always an ecosystem, there is always a pathway, and the purposes are the same.
That's it.
And so there's a lot of similarities. Yeah.
So I just want to, it's one final point, because I think often we want to think about it concretely, and so we sort of see this mapped out, and we immediately go to an organisational diagram, or immediately go to this is how you do it. It's got to be done this way.
Yeah.
And we want to keep extracting ourselves and thinking, what are the principles, and then how does this work in my context and for this size and for this time in our church life?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so second objection. This just all sounds far too corporate. In fact, I'm feeling like I'm sounding very corporate at the moment.
And you're a lawyer.
Yeah, that's it. But ecosystems, it's also it's a biological term as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So it also not only does it sound corporate, but it doesn't sound very loving or pastoral.
What's wrong with corporate? I think that's the thing we've got to dig into. So when someone says it's all corporate, what's wrong with corporate? Well, two things that can be wrong with corporate are, one, it's unloving because corporate's all about money, and two, it's not theological. What we've been working at showing in these podcasts is there is a solid theological basis behind this. So as we look into each of those purpose areas, we're looking at where you see them in the Bible. There is a solid theological basis there. It's also loving. It's love that drives you to get organised. It's love that drives you to figure out, we have these sheep, what's the best way to be able to look after them? And so at that level, it's not that it's corporate, but it is organised. But it's organised because of love, not because of a bottom line.
And so that's what I think is really important. We've got to understand that the church is an organisation. And in order to work, it needs to be organised. And pastoring with purpose is a way to help pastoral leaders think purposefully, intentionally about that overarching outcome that we're looking for, that all churches should have, that mission of making disciples.
Yeah, that's right. Love and organisation aren't opposed to each other. If you're in a big family, you know that. Organisation can be a way of loving people and should be a way of loving people.
One of the things that we talk about in the Reach Australia Development Program, it's a Venn diagram with getting the church leader to be thinking about their influence or their role, responsibility in the context of church life. And so there's this group of people, that we lead and love and pastorally care for. There's you as the leader, and then there's church as the organisation. And it's a beautiful Venn diagram where they're all sort of overlapping.
Yeah.
And you're forcing the church leader to actually think, well, what's my role in leading people? What's my role in leading the organisation? And then over the whole thing, there's this beautiful context, which is your local context, which is also needing to be thought into as well. Now, Greg, the role of the church leader in the New Testament is often described as a shepherd, and that shepherd concept is the main idea behind our English word pastor. So depending on your denominational bent, you might call yourself a church leader, a minister, a presbyter, a pastor, or any sort of range of things. But connected to all church leadership is the idea of pastorally shepherding the flock. Now, that concept seems pretty absent from the whole church ecosystem idea, although you seem to keep smuggling it, by just adding pastor to the purpose area, mission pastor,
Job done.
serve pastor. Is that just sort of, language?
Yeah. There's two thoughts to put into that. And one is we don't see pastoring as something that you just think about individually. You think about it as a team. And so we think about how do we pastor people. And so it's not just that people aren't just pastored when I open the Bible with them, but when the Bible is opened with them and I play a part in that. And so thinking about Sundays, all of our different teams are looking after people so that the Bible can be opened. They're all pastoring them. The other way to think about it, though, is if you're the membership pastor or the community pastor, how do you build your team and how do you speak to people? It's with the Bible open. So every team meeting, the Bible is open. Our area pastors, they do stacks and stacks of Bible teaching, but they also see themselves as part of the team that pastors everyone. That is, it's more of a community way of thinking rather than an individualistic way of thinking.
But if there's all these purpose pastors around, then who's my pastor? Who actually reads the Bible with me?
Yeah.
Who comes to visit me in the hospital? Who's the one making sure that I'm, following Jesus?
That's a great question. And the answer is, in our context, you don't have one, you got 6. That is, it's not just that you have the remote senior pastor who you wish you could talk to, but the fact is that 38 people want his time. You've got these leaders of the various departments, various purposes, who are all through church and who are there. And we really noticed it when people get married. In days gone by, I was the one that they asked because I was the guy out the front. Now, when people get married, the one that they ask to marry them is usually the head of the purpose area that they're doing ministry in, because those guys teach the Bible to them all the time. And so you don't have one, you got 6, and you actually have loads of pastoral experiences. You're looked after by your growth group, led by a leader. You're looked after your ministry team leader. You're looked after the purpose leader. I look after them through preaching. The fact is, pastoring is not meant to be, I don't think, this individual thing. It's a flock with a bunch of shepherds in lots of different roles.
So it's not that individual thing, but surely pastors are meant to be teaching the Bible. Now, I know you just made the comment, but the Bible's coming, but are they, are they teaching the Bible there?
Yeah.
Are they preaching?
Could it be that we're a little bit preaching centric in teaching the Bible? That unless somebody is out the front preaching, they're not Bible teaching. Because some of our purpose leaders don't do very much preaching. But I tell you what, the Bible is open all the time. They are deep in the Word as they lead their ministry teams all the time.
So I want to now press into some of the concerns that pastors have and church leaders have in this place. If I move towards this sort of purpose pastoring model, does that mean that I'm going to be unemployable? If I like, who's ever going to want a mission pastor in their church?
Who would ever want somebody who is fantastic at reaching the lost to be the pastor of their church? What a crazy idea. The fact is, everyone is a specialist. The idea that we're generalists or that they're a generalist, I think is a bit of a fallacy. If our guys were to leave, what would be the skill set they take with them? Well, the skill set of being a sacrificial pastor, doing what their church actually needs. The skill set of building teams that they teach the Bible to, the skill set of working within another larger team, they're all the skills that are incredibly transferable. And so I think rather than limiting the future employment prospects, I think you're actually increasing them. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't skills they need to pick up, but by and large those skills I think are fairly easy to attain.
I think one of the fears often in this is the loss of being able to regularly preach. And so when you do move into the context of a smaller church where, you'll need to preach regularly, that's something that potentially might not have been honed if you've been in a larger church or if you've just really focused on the mission pastoral role.
Yeah, I'd say our guys preach a lot. It mightn't necessarily all be on the Sunday to the whole gathering. It'll often be to their teams. And so they still do quite a lot of preaching. I wonder if, maybe just nudging into this a little bit, as important as preaching is, we've elevated it as 90% of the role of the senior pastor. But what we've been talking about with an ecosystem is the preaching on a Sunday is really crucial, it's really important, but the ecosystem, I would much rather a guy who is a pretty good preacher but is great at looking after the whole ecosystem and seeing that the whole thing works than the guy who is the gun preacher who is clueless about the rest.
So what, again, just sort of pushing more into that fear, what's interesting is that, the idea that if you were to jump back into, pastoral ministry and, where you had more of a preaching role, is the thought that you wouldn't actually...
Sorry, Scott, let's do it again.
Yeah, sorry.
Do you want to just wipe your eyes as well?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
I was trying not to cough,
I
and I was working hard not to cough.
And I'm like, oh no, what did Greg say? Scott's feeling insecure about his
I made a comment about SMBC.
That's it. Oh.
He's angry.
I hear me before I say this probably. I want to say, surely when you do jump back into having to preach, that you'll work hard at being a good preacher, won't you? Just like when you were leading a pastoral ministry role, an M, you were working hard to be the best at that.
Yeah, that's right. You do what your church needs.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say, but
I reckon jump in. I reckon that is actually worth saying. Yeah.
Yeah. I kind of just want to jump in because there's that feeling as though you by not exercising your preaching gift or that preaching ministry, you're going to become weak at it. And also, you're not actually going to have the opportunity to develop it, because that's really the pushback in this. If I come on a staff team and I only do a purpose area, then I'm not going to grow in some of those things like visiting people in hospital, leading a small group ministry, preaching as well. Now, I kind of want to push back on this and say, hopefully, if you were to jump back into being a solo church, that you would work hard at growing in the areas that you need to work at.
Yeah, the shepherd does what the flock needs. And if the flock needs me not to preach now, it means not preaching now. If in the future the flock needs me to preach now, then I'll work really hard at building those skills. I'll get a coach, I'll read books, I'll watch videos every single week. We could rebuild those skills if we need to.
Excellent. Now, another area to push into. I don't want to do purpose pastoring because I reckon I'm going to be really bored by just focusing on the one area all the time.
Yeah. Could it be that we've raised the importance of me really loving my job just a little bit too high? And really what we need to dwell on is, what does the flock really need? Now, when I stop and think about that, then I'm going to do what's really best for the flock. And so whether or not I enjoy it, I actually think that as a shepherd, you get great enjoyment out of seeing the flock loved and seeing the flock grow. The other way of thinking about it though is, while I may enjoy doing a broad range of things, the fact is I'm rarely good at a broad range of things. That's rarely the case. And so the best thing for the church can be that I recruit and train other people who are going to be better at it. And so what I need to do is subvert my love of variety to put it underneath what the flock needs, and actually the body that is already there with those gifts. And so maybe we just need to get over ourselves a bit.
So the final objection, that purpose pastoring is the cause of the senior pastor drought. So we've got all these guys who have focused so much on sort of specialty ministry. Also, they've loved being part of teams, and they've realised I'm not a guy who can lead a church now. So therefore, I don't want to put myself forward as a senior pastor. Yep. There's a lot going on this. This is a really complex one.
I was about to say exactly that. This is a complex thing, and rather than me providing the silver bullet answer, I'll throw out two thoughts. One, could it be that those guys who are working in teams were not the guys that we wanted as senior pastors anyway? Because the reason they're working so well in teams is they've found their area of gifting, and if we dragged them out and made them senior pastors, that's not actually what they were ideally suited to anyway, and so it wouldn't have solved the problem. The second thought is, when you have a church that's working really hard at all 5 of those purpose areas and building teams, you end up with quite a lot of people doing ministry. What's the key to getting a whole bunch of people as senior pastors? It's that 10 years earlier, those people started to lead a youth group. Those people started to serve at church. The more people we can have at the start of the funnel, the more we'll have at the end of the funnel. And so let's work really hard at doing this ecosystem kind of church and bringing hundreds of people into ministry.
Excellent. Now we could say lots on that, but we've run out of time. So if you've enjoyed this episode of the Reach Australia podcast, we hope that you'll enjoy the rest of this season. Feel free to share it with your mates. Feel free as well, I think, just to sit down with your ministry team and actually listen to the podcast together, particularly those first 4 episodes, and also at the back end of this podcast series where we really hone in and focus in on some of those specific purpose areas as well. And I mean, this is a good time probably just to say that we're really thankful for the time that you've given us, Greg, but also the time of your team. Hunter Bible Church has been just a real blessing in terms of opening up themselves to sort of, unpacking and asking the hard questions of what they've been doing here. And so it's been really helpful just to sort of get an insight into a church that's doing it okay and fairly well. And
that's, we think we're pretty average performers. And so, that's good to have a look at it.
If you're looking to move your church towards implementing a church ecosystem, pastoring with purpose, then you'll probably benefit from a church health consultation. Dave Lanham from Frenchs Forest Anglican Church in Sydney talks about that now.
What I love most about the consult was the way in which they were able to help us see the patterns and habits we were in and understand how in trying to do good, we weren't necessarily doing the best, or that we could look at some areas and refining those areas so as to prove to be more effective. One of the things we encourage a lot is how we're faithful in the way that we do ministry, but bringing in that element of how to be effective on top of being faithful. So to think through the stuff that gets in the way of the goals that we're seeking to achieve and the outcomes we're reaching for, and working at how to sort of make adjustments, be it big or small, and there were both, ways of refining so that we could hope to be and plan to be and strive to be more effective in the things that we do. What are the best things that we can do to be effective in mission, in reaching our local community with the gospel, and in the maturity ministry, building people up in knowing Jesus, rather than just going through the things that we know have worked, thinking how can we make them work better.
Well, for more information or to express your interest in the Reach Australia Leadership Development Program, go to reachaustralia.com.au. I'm Scott Sanders. Chat soon.